Hello and welcome to Varnblog. And today we're talking to Stephen of the Swolitariat fame.
Uh-oh.
And we're going to talk about why Trotskyism, particularly Grantite Trotskyism. And we'll get into some diversions why I might help Stephen actually talk about why I have to put another last name in front of a last name. Um, or a nom de plume, really. And we are also maybe talk about Henrik Grossman, Ted Reese, and Raccoon, and the sort of Trotskyist interest in the work of Henrik Grossman, which is sort of a recent development, actually, um, and why I find Grossman fascinating, but also somewhat unsatisfying. Um, and we'll get into that. So, uh, but we're going to start with Stephen telling us how he ended up a Marxist, how he ended up a Trotskyist, and how he ended up in the IMT. And that's the International Marxist Tendency for those of you who don't speak Trot.
Okay, so I'll just kind of rattle through here some sections on my political evolution, and you can stop me at any point
Mm-hmm.
and feel free to jump in. Okay, so um, as a kid, my dad was a former Trot and a social democrat. He was in the NDP in Canada, which is our Social Democratic Party, and he almost won a seat actually at one point, but that was for naught. Um, in 1992. And my mom was kind of a radical feminist and from a conservative Catholic family, the lone wolf there. Um, and I remember long drives, like my dad would tell us, me and my brother about the USSR and Trotsky. Sounded pretty cool. So I was always kind of came from a left background anyway. I
Mm-hmm.
read the manifesto in high school. Come to university, I followed my dad and got a degree in politics, and I had a particular interest in political economy. That kind of always drew me in, even if it wasn't necessarily, reading Marx or more Marxist economics. Um, I didn't actually encounter much Marx at all in university until I took a course called Capitalism. So we went through, Ricardo, Adam Smith, Marx. There was some Weber in there, a bunch of other stuff. But anyway, that class blew my mind, and I was kind of bought in ever since. I was like, this shit explains everything. Um, I was more or less a democratic socialist for the next 10 years. This would be about 2010. That's kind of the way I thought about how to get to socialism anyway. And then, but after university, there was like not really like I live in Kingston, and there's not really any organizations around that I could find. So I was kind of relegated to YouTube, which at the time was like all I could find was Chomsky, Richard Wolff, David Harvey, Michael Parenti, and that was some of my radical education for a while there. I ended up becoming an accidental Cliffite by googling. I googled Canadian socialist groups, and I came up with the International Socialists, which are part of the I guess ISO. And I
The
called.
International Socialists in Canada are part of the ISO. The
Yeah,
International Socialist Organization in the United States, while still Cliffite mostly, had split from was kicked out of the IST. So,
right. IST. That's the overarching organization. Yeah, they were kicked out, but in Canada, in Toronto. So I found them in Toronto, which is 3 hours away from where I am, and I contacted them, called them up. They asked me to like start working with them and like see if I could start a branch in Kingston, and I was like not really into that, but from then on I guess I was a member, and I paid like $15 for the whole year or something, and they just kept sending me stuff. There wasn't much involvement back and forth between them and I. Um, but I did. This was about the time when kind of wokeism started to become big, and SJWs were a big thing. And even as a leftist and as a Marxist, these people were grinding my gears, and this kind of trend. So and all the critiques I could find were from people like Jordan Peterson, and this was back in like 2012, 2011. I was listening to Jordan Peterson. I was the one of the original fans before it was cool, of Jordan Peterson on a local program called TV Ontario. They would have him on all the time to talk about stuff. And this is before he was a little less reactionary back then. I was into like Sam Harris and Adam Curtis and Hitchens too. A lot of atheists and kind of leftist. Well, Curtis I guess would be the only leftist political thinker, but
and that's debatable.
Yes. Well, left-ish, left liberal, maybe. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not materialist, and that's kind of the thing I figured out. That's the main problem with Curtis, anyway. But yeah, so then I ended up starting my YouTube channel in 2016. So it's the Swoletariat, and it started out as kind of my thought was like I would just hide my Marxism and just like present left ideas to like a normie audience. That's kind of what I thought I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And just like looked up other YouTubers on Marxist YouTubers, including Zero Books, which I found, and obviously I love that aesthetic because I was already into Adam Curtis, so they were just kind of the flip side of Adam Curtis, a materialist instead of an idealist Adam Curtis. But then I found on YouTube was, I mean, learning Marxism or leftism from YouTube is a big mistake because it's all
Yeah.
Stalinists and it's all anarchists and some sock nips. So it's I don't know it wasn't a good education, and I had the impression that Trotskyites were the worst of the worst. And when I eventually one of my childhood friends, I bumped into him and he said, we're doing this like Marxist school event thing. And it was the only one I'd really encountered in 10 years. So I was like, I'm in, sign me up. I don't care what it is, I'll go. And he was like, we're Trotsky's organization. I'm like, okay, well, I'll try you guys, see how it is. Um, and yeah, like I liked what I saw. They put on a big, a weekend of education on like imperialism, a whole bunch of different topics, Vietnam. They were very professional, which in contrast to some of the other kind of local, like anarchist groups and stuff, and even the IS, who I had been with for a couple of years, they were like very, I guess, like, I don't know, intersectional for a while. And they were kind of buying into a lot of that, the wokeism that I wasn't a fan of. I ended up getting kicked out or blocked on their Facebook page. I don't even remember why, but anyway, so yeah, the IMT appealed to me. Well, we can get into what I liked about it and didn't like about it. But do you have any questions in particular?
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because Trotskyism in the English speaking world has been overwhelmingly dominated by Cliffism for a long time.
Especially in the States.
Yeah, particularly in the U.S., but also because of the legacy of the SWP in the UK. It's not as true in Canada. Now, there are other Trotskyist organizations, the IMT, the IBT. That's the International Bolshevik Tendency. It's one of the two SPART tendencies. There's the US SWP, which is a mess, but was at one time Orthodox Trotskyist. And then you have the Latin American Trotskyists, which usually tend to be either Pabloites or Mandelites. And it's interesting that we have such clear traditions. Most of these trace back to specific splits in the Fourth International, mostly in the 50s and 60s, with the exception of like Shackman and that bunch, and James Burnham splitting in the 40s. And mostly around issues of positions about the status of the USSR. However,
yeah, state capitalism versus degenerated worker state or whatever.
Yeah, versus weird. Bureaucratic collectivism versus what? There's some other ones actually, but yeah. However, yeah. So we're even getting that. One of the interesting things about this is, despite the cause of splits being basically the USSR, we lost Stephen. And we got Steven back. All right. So despite the basic splits being around the USSR, there actually is a pretty substantive philosophical difference between the Cliffites and the Grantites, or the IMT versus the IS.
Maybe you can help me understand that, because when I ask people, or when I look up on the internet, it's like most of the split seems to be about like whether they consider the USSR state capitalists or deformed.
Yeah, that is the cause of the split. But over time, because the IS tendency was more popular, it seemed to have, and because it tended to have bigger publishing houses, not going to lie, it seemed to take an increasingly eclectic line on a lot of philosophical assumptions that you would have to be, that the IMT wouldn't tolerate as much. And I'll give you an example of that. Althusserianism was popular in the IS, right? So structural Marxism, anti-dialectical Marxism, like
okay, right? What we would call academic Marxism,
right? But it's more than just the fact it's academic. It actually, like, you could argue that many of the positions that the IMT gets hung up on could be largely considered academic debate points. I've read like Sewell and Wood's like breakdowns of historical and dialectical materialism, and they have very specific things that they care about. That, for example, other organizations like the Sparts, who hold the same line on what the Soviet Union was, for example, disagree with them about, or don't think is as important. So what you have basically is, I hate to make an analogy to religion, but you have like the fact, like in the Eastern Orthodox versus the Catholic Church, the actual schism is over something small, and mostly political. But over time, the philosophical differences accumulate. And I do think you saw that with the IS tradition. And the IS tradition was bigger on insisting, I say that when except for SALT in the United States, which complicates things. The IS tradition, though, was bigger on insisting that the workers' parties needed to be completely independent of any existing left or bourgeois party. But yeah, we're gonna have to get into a lot of these debates, though, and I think it's interesting because in the States, it seems like the Cliffites have just dissolved into nothing over basically corruption scandals around sex scandals, and the fact that they had a multi-million-dollar publishing house attached to them that really actually enforced some ethical norms on them.
Yeah, I've heard loose like about some of these scandals. But again, I don't follow. I don't follow much of the stuff. Like SALT, I encountered before. I found who they were before the IMT, and they seemed like, to me, they seemed fine. Like, I was like, it's an organization, they seem cool, but like, I didn't know the minutia of any of these things.
Right. I think it's also funny that, for example, American Stalinism or Marxist-Leninism is mostly represented by two parties that started off as Marcyite trot parties, and have gone so far as to edit like Wikipedia to change Sam Marcy's historical positions in relation to Trotskyism. I mean, technically, Marcy was a tanky in so much that he supported the tanks rolling into Hungary, but he was a Trotskyist. He actually saw specifically some kind of reconciliation with Maoists. I'll turn my mic down and help you out there. But what's been funny is over time, those parties have adopted a completely anti-revisionist line that they try to like revise their own history away. I guess technically the PSL could maybe say they were never a Trotskyist party because they split from the WWP. The WWP was Sam Marcy's party. what does all this matter? And to a large degree, it's hard to see why it matters anymore. I mean, the Soviet Union's dust. I would also say that, like in the United States, both the IMT and the remnants of the IS traditions outside of SALT are represented in the DSA.
Yep.
Why would professionalism's one thing. So let's talk about this. What do you get from being in the IMT in Canada? What's its relationship to the NDP, the New Democratic Party, and what do you get specifically from Ted Grant and his major interpreters, Alan Wood and is it Sowell or Sewell? I never sure how to pronounce
it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, our relationship to the NDP is it's got ebbs and flows. So right now, I think we're pushing for a couple people that we like. The president, there's a new president president of the NDP up for election. I forget who we've put forward to support, and then there's a new a candidate for leader that lost. Oh, what the hell's her name? Hold on, I have it here. Building Nikki Ashton. Yeah, we supported her, and we get called opportunists for supporting her, of course, because she's not as radical as us. But there was a good period, like 10 years or so, when we didn't work in the NDP at all because they had moved basically too far to the right, especially under Jagmeet, and before him, what's his face, Tom Mulcair, who was actually a former Liberal, I believe. And as for our relationship is in and out. We go in based on the conditions of whether there's a connection to the working class, which there kind of always is in the NDP, and also whether there's a chance that we can pull people there, and if the party's moving left enough, or at least or if there's a chance that the party's moving left enough. And what was the other question?
What are some of the benefits and the disadvantages of the organization? And then I'll answer some questions that are being asked us about Trotskyism in general, and some corrections. And I'm gonna slightly disagree with someone, but anyway, go ahead.
What I liked personally, I mean, is there was kind of a high barrier to entry. I don't know why my videos keeps cutting out, but it's a high barrier to entry. Like I was just in a reading group for months before they invited me to branch. I had an interview, or I had to make sure I agreed with everything, or the main points anyway. And they expect things of you, right? You have to show up to meetings every week, and you have to you're also expected to participate and to do reports, do what are they called, lead-offs, right, on different topics every week, so that you practice teaching other people the things that you've learned, so you become a good Marxist, which is all good. I mean, obviously, what we're learning is a little limited, especially me coming from a university background. It's like they basically want you sticking to, obviously, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Marx, but in the early stages, not even really that much Marx. I was kind of weirded out by that, but at the same time, it kind of makes sense in that a lot of people aren't going to have kind of a more, I don't know, academic interest in Marxism, and want to just and they want to use the Trotsky and the Lenin to actually get people trained up as quick as possible on how to kind of engage with the working class, which makes sense, but at the same time, it's like they're not necessarily right on everything, and we're not going to know that if we don't actually read the source material. But of course, a year or two down the road, you will read more Marx, other than Value, Price, and Profit, and the Manifesto. And yeah, again, the big focus on theoretical development, the long game too. Like I engaged with some anarchists and a lot of other kind of left liberal types, even socialists who are really kind of into the whole movementism thing and just like ready to go. Revolution's just around the corner. I like that we have kind of a more uh, longer term view of it. But I don't know if all Trotskyist organizations are like that or not. And I especially like the anti identity politics bent and some of their critiques on intersectionality in particular impressed me. In fact, right before I joined the organization, I had read one of their articles on intersectionality, and I liked it so much that I made a YouTube video about that, like based on that article, critiquing intersectionality from the left. Um, and I thought it was actually pretty good. It didn't straw man it like you see on the right or even some left critiques. Um, and their critique of queer theory and post-colonialism, I thought really good. But then in other areas, I think their critique's a little kind of weak and straw manny when they try to attack MMT and the post Keynesians. Um, like there's some truth to it, but they do it pretty lazily, to be honest. And like there's lots of points where you can if there was an MMT proponent there and you were repeating these critiques that we've been offering, they'd be like, no, that's not what we say, or that's bullshit. Like there's holes that can be poked in some of the critiques, and a lot of the literature we put out, for me, coming from the academic background, and I get made fun of this, like it's a little it's a little, I guess we have the Toronto Sun, which is for a newspaper for the working class, but it's a right-wing paper, and that's kind of what we're trying to be, the left-wing version of that. But a lot of the analysis is again a little it's not the highest quality, or it's like, I don't know, I don't know how to describe it. It's sometimes a bit cringe, and like aimed at workers with the assumption that workers aren't I don't know, like aren't highly educated on lots of things on these topics. Oh, I like the democratic centralism for sure. And even having questions about it, like um, that they say that democratic centralism is debate within, but united from without. Right? We put on a united front facing outwards to the world, and that when we get, let's say, the idea is that when you actually get to a worker state, that the same kind of democratic centralism principles don't necessarily apply to the worker state, right? That's just for the party itself. So you don't end up with China, Russia, or what the USSR devolved into, with this kind of democratic shell, but essentially undemocratic in practice.
Okay.
Although there's no guarantee that that'll actually happen, but they have a nice answer for it.
Do you have open slate voting?
It's not secret, yeah, which is one. But again, that's within the party, so they would say that when the worker state comes about, that version of democracy will be different from the kind we have.
Then why do you keep a Bolshevik voting structure from after 1921?
What do you mean? The open slate?
All the Trotskyist parties with the open slate voting keep a Bolshevik voting policy that was instituted after the Civil War, during the Protocols of War communism.
I don't know. I can't defend it, but we do.
All right. I mean, it's something that I'm a Marxologist and a Leninologist. I'm not one of those academic Marxists. I've never made a career off of publishing about Marx, and in fact, when I publish, it'll be about later Marxists. But like, I take Marxology and also Bolshevicology, if I can make up a term, very, very seriously. I actually, of the trots that I've worked with, so I want to give. I sound like that was a gotcha moment. The IMT is one of the ones that annoys me the least, with the exception of some weird stances on science that two people in the high levels of, Yeah, the Big Bang, and also some stuff on Darwinism that is a little bit like I know why it's held. I know I actually know the philosophical the positions and where they're coming from.
Did you read the? Do we have an article on the Big Bang?
Yes, I've read it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's the greatest defense or not, but it's something.
But what I'll say is in 19th and early 20th century, I actually get why they felt that way. With the discovery of background radiation, they would need to posit an alternate cosmology, and they need scientists to do it. And you would have to argue it from a non-philosophical basis, and that hasn't happened yet. There is some debate if you were to say, for example, that the background radiation comes from a crunch, that still implies an eternally existent material universe, but that's not like that's it. And what I find funny is that's so irrelevant to like workers' politics that I don't know why it's like kind of a big deal.
Well, you know what? It's almost annoying to me because like people make fun of us for that. You know, Alan Woods' take on that. I think, or was it Woods or was it Ted Grant that his take on that? Anyway,
it's Woods is the one who wrote it down. So
okay, yeah. Well, what my gripe is that we included it in our goddamn pamphlet that we use on all the newbies, right? So when we do it's either historical materialism or dialectical. I think it's dialectical materialism. The first pamphlet they read is like the Big Bang is fake news. It's like, god damn it, we have to like, so anytime someone's leading a reading group, we have to like, oh, we got to explain this part again. And they don't give us much help on that either, right? There's no there is an article, but like they're just like, read this. It's, I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, it just as a weird strategy, there's hangups like that I'm like, I'm with you guys on focusing on the proletariat and the proletariat. In fact, I used to listen to In Defense of Marxism's podcast when the IMT was putting it out regularly, and it did do explications of Marx and Marxism in daily life that was better than most of the academic stuff and easily understandable. And there was really only like 3 groups at the time. This would have been in the early teens, like, around 2010, 2011, 2012, that did anything like that. I mean, you could have the ISO in America doing their socialism conference. Like, they would turn that into a podcast, and that was not very useful. So yeah,
It's annoying.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird thing to focus in on. There's also some stuff on Lamarckianism that I think is a little weird, but in general, I get where the IMT is coming from, and I actually know, like, historically why they hold these positions. It's weird to ride or die on physics and historical materialism based off of 19th century, early 20th century science. One of the things I'll say about, though, for people who ask me some questions that came up when they're asking me about other tendencies. So Mandelites or Pluralites after they kicked out Pablo. Yeah, I know there's not that much difference. That's spiritual manlit. SALT isn't part of the IS tradition. I kind of want to debate that, but only because of their relationship to solidarity. Technically speaking, no. SALT in the United States is not part of the IS tradition. Even I sometimes forget that we're not talking about SALT in Australia, which is. SALT in America is actually, I believe they got kicked out of the USSWP for maintaining permanent revolution status. In the early 1980s, maybe between 1981 and 1983. So somebody asked me, this gets to another question that brings us to the Pathfinder tendency. The Pathfinder tendency is a tendency that came out of the USSWP when it abandoned permanent revolution with their revolution and ours, and their Trotsky and ours, I think is the actual pamphlet, so that they could defend Cuba. And, later on, clearly defend
Cuba.
Yeah, you defend Cuba on critical support grounds, though.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and these are such to non-Trotskyists. These distinctions, yeah, mean so little. But they matter. I know I was in it. I know saw history. Yeah. So that's spiritual mantle again. The issue is workers' power joined with SALT and Solidarity, and workers' power is an IS split, right? So Solidarity does have IS ties, historically speaking, whereas SALT directly does not. And yeah, people say this sounds like different versions of Baptist arguing. What gets really fascinating, like I said, with the example of the Sam Marcy tendencies, then I haven't even brought out like the Northite tendencies, and that's the SEP and the who are known for the World Socialist website, and their anti-union is within the spectrum of Trotskyism after 1992. You can find positions that mirror almost everything else on the non-Trotskyist left, particularly within the IS traditions, where like you get some really wild, like people trying to combine Trotsky with Althusser, which is basically like Trotskyism plus Stalinism.
Do you know Socialist Action?
Yeah, Socialist Action in the U.S. or in the U.K. because they're different.
I don't know, because in Canada we have them, and I'm not sure what international they're part of, if they're part of any, but I think they're like the second or third biggest.
I think they're CIW, right? They're big in the United States too.
Yeah, okay. So we have to interact with them, and it's like night and day. Like, holy crap! Like, we're trying to organize a May Day rally, and like I've never seen more sectarian. Like I just got my introduction to sectarianism and like inter-left politics like these past few months, dealing with these people and a couple Sparts on the side too. And holy crap, like the amount of like demagoguery and just like dirty tricks and like and just like trying to uh, make meetings as difficult as possible and making us all as socialists all look bad to the workers that are trying to organize these damn rallies and stuff is insane. And these people are like insisting on like, oh, we need at least one woman chair of the meeting, and like the very very intersectional, very feminist stuff going on too. It's like what they're they're wreckers.
It's funny. I've been at DSA meetings where they've actually asked men to declare themselves non-binary so that they could meet the quota of non-men in the ruling committee, because they burnt through all their women by forcing them into leadership and burning them out.
Yeah, that's what we're having to deal with right now. And like some of these people live, like in person, you could go rally and for supporting some cause or whatever, or at some strike, and you'll see us show up and get a good reaction, and then you'll get some Sparks show up and spend the whole time denouncing us loudly. these opportunists, they supported this, that, and the other. It's hilarious.
Oh, right. You're right, spiritual manlet. SALT was never formally in. I misunderstood. SALT was never formally in. Solidarity, Socialist Unity, which is a SALT split, was. So, thus proving the old adage, how many Trotskyists does it take to screw in a light bulb? One, but it'll divide into 84 fourth internationals. So people should know my background and what one of my theses on this, which I think you might find a little frustrating. I come from Platypus, which is not a Trotskyist organization by any stretch of the imagination, although it has a Trotskyist history, and it sees itself as a development out of the Spartacist tendency.
Yeah, I've looked into them.
Yeah, I was a member for about a year and a half, and I was a fellow traveler for about a year prior. And it's similar to the IMT where you have to go through reading groups before you're asked in, and it's also democratic centralist, although it has a more complicated structure because we have both group leaders and pedagogues that are voted on.
Who's the guy that Doug has on all the time?
Chris Catrone.
Yes, Catrone. He's an interesting cat. I just remember watching him in a couple of his interviews. He'll just say things so confidently that are just can seem wild, but like he says them so confidently, like, oh, that must be true.
Yeah, he's good at that. I'll leave it at that. I left that group for a reason. For one, like saying that, I mean, I will say one of the theses of Platypus is critical theory and Trotskyism are not just copacetic, but one is actually kind of an esoteric development of the other, which is really hard to defend.
I mean, it's yeah, I can see they're definitely kind of oil and water there, but that I mean, I've been influenced by critical theory as well, not deeply, but to me, that's sort of uh, uh, what might help the movement a bit more, because there's very little kind of self reflection on a lot of things.
I mean,
they would say all the
mm-hmm. Go ahead.
They would say all the old ideas are the right ideas, and they're not really willing to look outwards or critique anything really that Marx ever said, or Lenin, or even Trotsky.
Right. Well, I mean, I'll give you an example of of some things that Trotskyists do that do bug me. For example, the transitional program was not originally titled the transitional program. Do you know why?
Well, it's part of some manuscripts or something?
It's part of a manuscript called The Death Nails of Capitalism, which predicted that capitalism would end in the 1950s.
Right.
So the focus on calling it the transitional program, which is part of the text, legitimately, like it is in the text, is to kind of remove that there's a wrong prediction in the text itself. Yes, the death agony of capitalism. So
the transitional program to me is one of those things. I read it, I've done presentations on it, I've had to teach it. To me, like I read through it and it's like, yeah, that could work, but I'm not sure that it's the only way to get to socialism. It seems like a way, and it doesn't necessarily seem like, I don't know, like it kind of assumes a lot, with in terms of creating class consciousness out of revealing bank secrets or whatever. Like I'm not sure that that B follows A necessarily in all those things, but they're not bad ideas.
Right. So what I find interesting, though, maybe we can come back to this now, is to people who are outside of this orbit, most of this, and you see it, being talked about here with they comparing this to different religions, is that the central trauma of like trying to analyze what the USSR was seems somewhat lost on the USSR's actual degeneration in 1992, particularly because most of the Trotskyist organizations had approaches that, depending on how you read their predictions, either were wrong or they were vague. and I could go into specific ones, but like the degenerated worker state thesis posited that the way that would likely, what would likely happen was that the workers would eventually overcome the Bonapartism in the Soviet Union that was causing it to degenerate. Right? Like, that's sort of the idea.
Mm-hmm.
There were people, I think there are people in the tech, there's people in all the traditions actually that saw that it could turn into something like capitalism. But none of them called it exactly as it happened, which is like, this weird mixture of the common souls co-ops that were allowed during perestroika mixing up with elements of the criminal underground to form a kind of oligarchical cartel, like like the West really messing around with it, although I guess everybody should have saw that coming.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to read a lot of Trotskyism in presentations of Trotskyism, in contradistinction to like older Marxism. And I say that because there are things, for example, that Trotskyists will present as straight up, Marx, that are legitimate developments from Marx, but aren't really in Marx himself. And I'll give you an example of that. Historical and dialectical materialism are not codified in Marx at all. And in fact,
right.
Dialectical materialism, I think it's specifically a German, Joseph Datsun, I believe. I'm probably mispronouncing that. In fact, I know I am. Joseph Jetzgen. Dietzgen. There we go. I can kind of speak German. That's probably still wrong though. In 1887, still close enough to the horse's mouth that I think you consider it like a serious development for Marxism, right? But there's codifications that I've seen both in Woods and not to pick on Woods. Like, I've also seen it in the Mandalite presentations and in the Spart presentations that'll make claims that stuff goes directly back to Marx and Engels that I can't find. And they go back to, when I find the first instantiations of them, they either go back to Kautsky or they go back to early Bolshevik interpretations of events. Which isn't, in and of itself is not a problem, but it just needs to be acknowledged.
Right. Like, so it's not a lie to say that it's Marxism.
Right. It's not.
Yeah. No,
it's not. But I will say this: when you're trying to argue against Marxist-Leninists, it makes it a little harder to clarify your positions, particularly when I don't hear as much about the things that actually make Trotskyism unique. This is one of the reasons why I actually kind of like the IMT, because they admit stuff like permanent revolution, for example. Whereas, and that's kind of unique, that like you can get it from Marx, but like everybody kind of admits that exegesis of Marx goes back to Trotsky, like pretty explicitly. And that's a real distinction from anything in Marxist-Leninism.
Which is one of possibly the most important difference. Right.
But what you saw over time, I think to some degree in the IS tradition, although they never really formally gave it up, but definitely in the Pathfinder tendency and in the USSWP, was a tendency to drop that. They also dropped it in the Marxite tendencies, right? So that they were more copacetic with Maoism or whatever, particularly when Maoists were opposed to the properly speaking USSR.
Permanent revolution just seems so like commonsensically, obviously true, right? It just seems like common sense. Like, of course, class collaboration is not going to work. Of course, popular fronts are not going to work.
Well, it's important to know that it's not that doesn't just cut against the Popular Front, and it cuts against like some interpretations of the Second International's United Front strategy. Because like Trotsky didn't come up with that. That's the position of the early Second International, right? It's only after, the Comintern, drops third periodism, where they completely obliterate United Front tactics for Pop Front tactics. This permanent revolution. Someone's asking. So let's define what permanent revolution is. Can you define it? In shorthand.
Shorthand. Permanent revolution means basically that you don't necessarily have to go through a capitalist stage where you side with the bourgeoisie in order to fight maybe the right-wing bourgeoisie or fascists, or well, no, you would side for fascists, but for imperialists or colonizers, you don't need to go through that stage first. Like for, let's say, in Ireland, this is a good example. They the Stalinists in Ireland believe that the fight for national independence comes first, and then once we've won that, then the working class can get together and kick out their bourgeoisie. But yeah, the permanent revolution says no. You stay independent as a class the whole time.
Right.
And I think there's more to it than that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's their Trotsky and ours, Spiritual Manlet, who's apparently more of a Trotsky nerd than even I am, at least on assault and Pathfinder related tendencies. There's so much. The thing is, whenever you talk about Trotskyism, it's good to go to here first, because one of the things that we need to point out is some of the major Trotskyist parties have dropped this, but this is, to me, the thing that is clear about Trotskyism as opposed to like Bukharinism, right? So what does that mean? So let's break down, this a little bit more. Permanent revolution. Permanent revolution says that the bourgeois democratic revolution is insufficient, that the bourgeoisie had become passive way before the establishment of even the USSR, and that the peasantry, in so much that I love that we have so much discussion of peasant questions now in Marxism, as if
yeah,
it's a major component of the world, even in the developing world anymore. In fact, I was reading that like nowhere on Earth is the peasantry any longer a majority of the population. That the peasantry would naturally side with the proletariat once they won, as opposed to Bukharin's and frankly even Lenin's insistence that you needed an alliance with the peasantry that took their interest in to keep them in the coalition politically, which is kind of important when you're dealing with underdeveloped states.
Yeah, 1917 Russia.
Right.
But not important in 2021 Canada.
Right. It's not important at all in the imperial core. Like, absolutely. It's not even important. Like, it's not even important in China, which still has a peasantry. So it's interesting, because if there's no peasantry, what does it mean to not hold on to permanent revolution? It means that basically you believe that you need to make allegiances with the progressive bourgeoisie against the comprador bourgeoisie.
What do you mean by comprador?
These are Maoist categories, so this would make sense you don't know them. I've just explained in Maoist tendency. The comprador bourgeoisie is the internationalist bourgeoisie versus the nationalist progressive bourgeoisie. Now,
Ah,
while
that doesn't.
the nationalist bourgeoisie that's only supposed to apply to the developing world. So this gives you an excuse to do bourgeois developmentalism and unite pop front tactics basically on a broad scale within a nation. Was Mao the most? Mao wasn't a Bukharinite actually, but that's another thing.
Wasn't Ho Chi Minh?
Yeah, Ho Chi Minh was closer to Bukharin. Mao was all over the place, but Mao actually was pulling not from Bukharin, but from actually Kropotkin and anarchist theories that he was then retrofitting onto his knowledge of Marxism, which he read. Which from Mao's diaries we know and from the Soviet archives we know he read it. Stalin, Lenin, Marx in that order, What differentiates Trotsky's Permanent Revolution from the National Democratic Revolution's Bloc of Four Classes People's War? That basically Trotsky would say that that's class collaborationist in the extreme, that either the proletariat takes the front or I'm being historically accurate. The people can cry about it if they want to. I may mess up which Trotskyist group split from which one in what year off the top of my head, but I'm not going to mess up the actual history of Mao's development because I know that very well. I was since I lived in Asia, I knew a lot of people who had gone to China starting off as Maoists to study it, and ended up being some of them being diehard anti-communist after this happened. So and other people were doing national bourgeoisie apologetics, which is something that would be very different from the Bloc of Four Classes People's War. I mean, People's War, when applied to the developed world, is basically populism. That's mass. If mass line sounds like a very elaborate way to say populism to you, that it's because it kind of is.
That's a really good point, actually. Now that you say that, it does sound exactly like populism.
And the other thing, yes, permanent revolution implies that you can't do this in one country; it must constantly expand. So the reason why that's the case, is why the revolution is permanently expanding, is because you wouldn't make any consideration for national blocks and development of this strategy. So while Trotskyists do not go as far as some left communists, and I say some because Bordigists actually don't hold anti-national liberation views, they would still think that countries liberating themselves against capital is a good thing. They would still say you would only support bourgeois parties in a parliament on issues. You would never join their government, and you would be an active. You would be actively trying to undermine and overthrow their government. Those bourgeois governments for a communist one that would join up with the International. Yeah, I know. I was actually thinking about the Edward Snow. There's also stuff about it in the Soviet archives. In fact, Stalin apparently considered executing Mao early on because of his Kropotkinist views. Are Bordigists allowed to hold views? Invariantly. All right. Now we're getting into you guys are, it's like we're talking about Protestantism and you're bringing up Eastern Orthodox sectarianism into the things, like we're talking about old believers and stuff. We're going to just confuse normies with this stuff. Steven, you get a kick out of this. Last week I got chastised for using the term normie. I got told that I was alt-right adjacent by someone who'd known me for 19 years.
Amazing. That's I remember there was a kind of a movement for normie socialism.
Yeah,
a year ago or so. I don't know about a movement, but I remember I was kind of talking about that too. And actually, Kay, that's one of the things I wanted to bring up about the IMT and probably left organizations in general, is that Um, while you definitely find a lot of like really engaging and intelligent, even normie comrades, you still have the same problem of a lot of the people that are in the organization or that get invited into the organization are they're no vanguards. These would be kind of antisocial, kind of weird, like people that really they're I don't know, they have mental health issues or typical leftist things, and you still see a lot of that, which is a little concerning. But then some of the other comrades are very impressive and very able to engage with conservative or normie workers, in a way too. So there's definitely a bit of both, but I for the longest time I hated every socialist I ever talked to because they were all just terrible people. They were all just either shrills or boring or um, you know uh, introverts that like never had anything interesting to say, or you couldn't have a beer with them. Now there's definitely I found some in the organization, but a lot, but you still have some of those same problems.
Well, I mean, I think that's to be fair to Trotskyist or any weirdo sectarian group is weirdo sectarian groups attract the most alienated first. That was true about Marxist. I mean, like you read stuff about the First International, and you're like, how did they do anything? Like, and they did. I mean, some of these people were like were like veterans from 1848. They weren't incompetent, but then you hear about like even Marx. I mean, Marx was like, you know, racked up with carbuncles that were literally killing him, and just got a contract to write what would become volume one of Das Kapital, and then he takes time like a year off to try to publish an attack on some of a fairly prominent German socialist called Herr Voigt, who came up with a conspiracy theory against him, but he couldn't even get it like published in Germany. So he wrote it and published it in English, and it never saw print in Germany, and no one ever like it didn't work to defend his name, and he wasted a year. Yeah, Marx would drain his own carbuncles with a knife sometimes. Other times he'd wait for Ingalls to be able to help him go to the doctor by pawning, and then Ingalls buying back his stuff. Um, yeah, yeah. I will tell you, reading about Marx from 18 until the First International, from like 1855 to like 1867, is one of the most depressing things ever, because it's just like the dude's almost dying of sepsis every other month. Like, it's just bad. Um, so I got some specific questions for you, and then we might talk about your obsession with Grossman. Um, any thoughts on the recent NDP convention? What are your thoughts on the New Democratic Party in Canada and where it's going, Brother Swole?
Well, in a lot of ways, it's pretty embarrassing. But there was one good thing that came out of it, which was uh, we we didn't do the same thing the British Labour Party did, and we got away from this anti-Palestine or at least pro-Israel stance. We've I think that we voted on to condemn the Israeli position on Palestine settlements. That just happened a day or two ago, because they were basically trying to do the same thing to the NDP that the laborites were doing to Corbyn. Um, and of course, Nikki Ashton and Corbyn just had an online meeting a week ago as well, which was nice. But what was the other half of that question?
They're just asking you how do you think it went.
Oh, I didn't follow that closely. I mostly just heard kind of some of the highlights. And I believe, we're still looking to pick a new president, and so we have a candidate in mind, who's more open to more militant unionism and and having socialists in the party.
So legacy admission Trudeau might have a left flank enemy.
Trudeau is actually talking about UBI now, and so like the mainstream of the NDP, I mean, they're gonna have a hard time staying relevant if Trudeau actually goes through with that. I do want to ask you one thing though. It's kind of a major thing actually about the IMT and Leninism in general, and you're not a Trotskyist.
Nope.
You obviously see problems or faults in the Leninist model, but like so where does the Marxist go? Where does the socialist go? If not, if the IMT is the least annoying of this of the sex, then and we gotta organize the working class. Maybe we're not doing it in the best possible way, and maybe the conditions aren't the same as they were 100 years ago. But what other option is there, and why might Leninism, democratic centralism, like what's the issue there?
Democratic centralism can exist without Leninism. I mean, I think my critical, my one example of one reason I have some distrust of it, even though I think functionally most things actually end up being democratic centralist if they're democratic, is, for example, like Kautsky's war bonds vote. For a long time, Trotskyists used to say they voted for the war bonds, and you'll see that in most Trotskyist literature. I used to think they were lying. Because that was a Lenin attack. But I discovered actually that we didn't know what Kautsky's vote was for a long time. Because of democratic centralism, they actually suppressed the internal votes. So what Kautsky did is sat on his hands, which is still pretty bad. But like, he did not actually support the war bond issue. He sat on his hands in neutrality because he didn't want to split the party. And then when the right of the SPD won, he had to sign off on it under democratic centralist principles. And so when Lenin was attacking him for that, Lenin was actually attacking him off of things that he knew to be true based off of Dimsent. So those kind of things. Like, I get putting up a united front, and effectively any organization that wants to exist has got to do it, right? Otherwise, you're going to have people splitting all the time. But one of the ironies of these dim set lines within Trotskyism is that it's made Trotskyism super fractious. Like I said, how many times have we gotten to the point where like a minor interpretation issue leads to a split? And some of those interpretations aren't minor, admittedly. Like I actually do think from the 1940s to 1980s, what you thought the Soviet Union was actually pretty important to what your strategic alignment in the world would be, and these were internationals. So that's not like it's not as arcane and esoteric at the time as it feels to us now. But what I tell people right now is like in the United States, what are you even entering into? You want to create a party that creates the workers' movement dependent on the workers' movement that created the party. That's definitely true for the DSA, but it's also true for a lot of the other like party building apparatuses. The assumption is that you would create the class for itself before having to organize the class in itself.
Yeah, we're kind of at that historical moment where that's a bit of a problem.
Yeah, so it's kind of a cul-de-sac no matter where you go. Now, like, I come
but then where else is there to go?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. What I would say is the IMT... How many splits happened because you were pedantic because nerds weren't able to emotionally validate each other? I don't think that's the case, actually, for the Trotskyist splits in the 50s at all. Because these were not largely academics. the academic dominance of Trotskyism actually happened after the splits, and a lot of tendencies try to hold off against it. But Trotskyism, like Maoism, like Marxist-Leninism, like social democracy, did go through the long march through the academy after the New Left. The holdouts that didn't were largely not in the United States. So, why do the splits happen with bookish nerds who weren't able to emotionally validate each other? That's probably a lot of it's true about why microsex can't get off the ground now. But I'm gonna point to the DSA as a shot against that kind of thought. The DSA is so highly confederated to keep everybody in, but it doesn't end up being truly multi-tendency. The national ends up being a tendency of itself that is basically an auxiliary of the Democratic Party that can then use its various radical locals and caucuses as excuses for its radicalism without doing anything about its own national tendency. So the splits in the 1950s are questions of tactics: entryism versus non-entryism, who you're arming struggle, what national revolutions are your parties in those countries going to support. This is not like leftist cheerleading stuff on Twitter today. But it gets so I think another problem that we have when we look at the problems of Trotskyism today is we read it in terms of the hyper-mediated landscape that we exist on now, where we all found each other through Twitter or whatever. We were all academics first, or blah 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 blah. Or we met at a DSA meeting, your church social for socialist,
yeah,
or whatever.
Instead of in the factory,
right? I mean, I'll give you an example of this from my own life. I went to the DSA in New Orleans to do educational work with them there, because the DSA in New Orleans was actually largely, it was pretty radical, and actually largely came from, at least it was 50% from actual working class people, right? And I came there to discuss the history of Marxist political programs, how they caused splits, who did what, where these idea of programs came from, etc. And who showed up to heckle me? Not some Marxist-Leninist group. The two of the ISO members of the area came up to yell at me because I was citing Carl Draper, and then talk about how that we weren't doing enough to unite working people, and a classroom full of working people who admittedly were having trouble following my train of thought, and I was having to re-gear towards teaching people who didn't know anything about leftism at all. And then having this ISOer yell at me, but guess what this ISOer was? A college student who had the time to go be a gadfly to other organizations.
Yeah. Right. And yeah, that's like right now, for instance, Fight Back in the IMT, we're kind of our focus is growth, obviously, and a lot of it's focused on students. But we also have a core of workers and union workers in particular, which is nice. So they're and those are the people that are organizing, for example, the May Day rally committee, which won't happen because of the lockdowns. But it's there you find a lot of the more kind of grounded people who have without them we kind of this would be all too theoretical. But we do have that core of people, I think, that are able to connect with other workers and to ground the rest of us who don't have that. Right now I've been a worker, several restaurants, stuff. I've been working class my whole life. I'm a business owner now, so I'm petty bouge, but I have no right now I have no connection to other workers, to unions, or anything like that. So all I can do is kind of help teach other people.
Right. Um, I am a teacher, and who the hell knows what we are. And I'm a member of a union, and I do agitation there. But it's it's to the right of most Democrats as a union, so it's where we are. Um, what I would say, would you ask me where we are to go, is like there's so many things we need to be building right now, and I'm not just talking about base building and the primitive accumulation of cadres. Like you need to be in the U.S. You need to be working on some way to get past uh, anti-union restrictions. You need to be working on dealing with the de-radicalization of the unions altogether. Um, which not only are we only 17% unionized, our unions are outside of the industrial Midwestern cities are largely not very radical at all. We have to deal with our hypersectarianism, which I completely agree. We have to be able to have multi-tendency reactions, which is something I'll give again. The IMT is super sectarian about who joins the tendency, but in a broader workers' party, they would not demand being the only represented tendency.
Right. And we work with other groups.
Right. And that's super important. Like this is why I will talk to anyone, even MLs. But obviously even MLs, I say it.
Even MLs.
Even MLs.
Even the worst of the worst.
I think the worst of the worst is the post left.
We can talk about them too.
And by post left, I mean the current post left, because there have been other post lefts that I'll defend, but this current batch is grody. How do you take? I mean, part of it, I think, to talk about the trajectory of the post left, is if you take social democracy as your limited horizon, and you take social democracy within having to work in collaboration with the Democratic Party or with the Republican Party as your other horizon, that logic does make a certain kind of like inverted opportunist sense, right? Well, you can't tail the Democrats; they're obviously not where the working people are. So where are you going to tail? The even more reactionary
Yeah.
Yeah, and as Grimlock's saying, you might as well call them the anti-left. Some of them are explicitly anti-left. It's not a coherent grouping. But I also think in the United States, you're getting into a situation where if you, from an individualist psychological level, okay, if you wanted to differentiate yourself from Democrats, you can become an ML. Well, that is obviously not super appealing to a lot of people. So where else are you going to go? And if you want to differentiate yourself from Democrats, now that the IS tradition seems to have totally capitulated, then
the post left is appealing, right? Like, like they're especially in a normie sense, right? They spend all their time, all of it, critiquing the left, critiquing Democrats. They've given up on Democrats. They don't care about Democrats. They critique people who funnel people to the Democrats. Well, no, they critique AOC and stuff, but like, so and the social justice warriors too, just as much, but in doing so, they don't do it the way the IMT does it. They don't just critique them. They do it while kind of backing the Tuckers and saying that these people are like promoting your interests somehow, and then they think we like I've had the hardest time trying to understand the post stuff because I'll listen to an episode of What's Left and Amy Therese and agree with like these are great critiques, like these are like 95% of this of what I'm hearing is great. The critiques of like how the left funnels people into the Democratic Party and the NGO industrial complex and all that jazz, and how everybody is basically on the left is kind of hypocritical, or at least most people on the left is hypocritical, kind of just in it for themselves and trying to get into this pat you on the back, PMC thing going on. But then they have these weird positions. Like to me, they seem like the new version of ultras because like the for some reason, I asked Amy outright, like, so you're saying we shouldn't engage in unions at all. We shouldn't try to change them. We shouldn't try to radicalize them, make them more militant. She's like, no, not like unions are a uh, they're they're only connected to the Democratic Party, and they can only possibly work for capital, and there's it can't be reformed. It's to me it's an ultra position, and and then they have this. I talked to another friend of mine who's been influenced by the post left, and they've got this like weird position on like how do we get to socialism? Well, we side with the petty bourgeois, and like I don't understand. That blew my mind. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about?
Well, because they're pulling that PMC theory is hiding some anti-Marxist class theories and dressing them up with, you know, a kind of social democratic Marxist critique from the 80s, but taken for a different purpose. So what they mean now is like they want what they want is a counter elite, which is the petit bourgeois, which that theory explicitly comes from sort of center rightist enlightened nationalists like Michael Lind.
Right? Yeah, they talk about Lind a lot.
Yeah, and Lind's an anti-Marxist explicitly, and he was a member of the American Enterprise Institute. His class theory comes from Weber plus his own stuff. And if you know that, it's actually fine to read it. But when you try to dress it up in Mars clothing,
yeah,
you can see that it's a bait. You also see like, yeah, I mean, Amy will take wild positions like attacking like defending Israel just to get at Nathan Robinson, or like
yeah. If the Democrats like it, it's bad, no matter what. Or if leftists like it, it's bad. That's
right, like
anything.
Like
any left position is wrong.
And yeah, when they talk about the working class, they actually mean the petit bourgeois, and some people are smart enough to say it. And then you realize, oh, okay, this is a distinctly anti-Marxist tendency, but they figured out how to dress it up in Marx language. And like, people should be aware that the right's been doing this forever. The post left is a synthesis of Amigo Babdiga and Turco Carlson. Oh, I mean, that's kind of wrong, but it's also kind of hilarious. But what's interesting about it is they're ultras for social democracy.
Yeah, which
is like kind of insane. And yeah, they do have a structural similarity to National Bolshevism, for example. Limonov, Dugin, that sort of thing. Yeah, Yankee.
They're obsessed with immigration. They're obsessed with this open borders thing. Like, it's such a non-issue that, like, but to them, it's the biggest thing. They say, the only way to win workers over or the petty bourgeois is to shut down, to build the wall, right? There's one of their slogans is build the wall, Medicare for all. But building the wall won't. Let's say you're able to stop all immigration. That does nothing. That really does nothing for workers. In fact, like, all that cheap labor is going to make goods that much more expensive.
I mean, yeah, but it's gonna. You're going to pay for it
cutting off all that labor. Yeah,
you're going to pay for it one end or the other, right? As far as the working class goes, and also like what they want to. If you're empowering the petit bourgeois, like, let's be honest, you're empowering the part of capital that tends to be the crappiest to workers. Like, sounds like settler socialism. I mean, like, yeah, of course, if even that, like, so, I mean, they're icky and they're bad, which is basically what the commentary is saying. Like, they're icky, bad, they're racist, etc., etc. But it would be a disaster to implement their policies even beyond that. Like, um, yeah, to quote you, I'll just pop this up. Debs is right about this. Um, and that I remember like when Angela Nagel took that quote of Marx and put it in that American Affairs article and cut off the part that made it mean the opposite of what she said it meant. Um, and I was like, what do you make of Marx saying the workers of the world know no borders? Like, like fundamentally, and also just as an economic proposition, like you want to, and this can get us into what the other part of this that we're going to talk about tonight, where we can be a little bit more coherent. Um, is um, that would accelerate the declining rates of profits like a mofo. Like,
yeah, big time, huge. I mean, they're if that's their goal, then they're accelerationists.
yeah, well, but I'm not. They would never state it like that. They actually think they're going to be delivering workers goods. So they're either stupid, or
I think they're
they're
partially
lying
stupid.
about their position, or both.
Yeah. It's hard to tell because some of them genuinely, I think, genuinely believe in this stuff, and then some of them like it's not, it can't be an accident that a lot of Amy's followers are fascists, and then when she says something, against racism or whatever, then those people get pissed off. Like you'll see in the comments, like a bunch of fascists being like, "Meh," like but she's cultivated that, and that can't be. Um, it's not an accident.
Right. Well, I mean, a Lebanese Australian on Twitter should hardly be the damage starter that she is. But also, I find it interesting that she never comments on Australian politics ever. It is always American politics. And one of the things I will say about a lot of these, um, a lot of the faces of these PNC movements is they're women, which seems to address a lot of the whole like over male dominance on the left thing. But they're saying stuff that people would want to hear who are anti-feminist.
Yeah.
That most of them are not from the U.S. Have you like at all? But they only talk about U.S. politics, except for Nagel. Nagel will occasionally talk about Irish politics. And I mean, there's, and then you have people like Michael Shayuna who were social democrats, but are like on the payroll of the Swedish Democrats, which is a
Yeah.
nationalist party. Um, so they don't have any
The
pull outside of Twitter, though. I don't know. Whenever people say nothing has something outside of no pull outside of Twitter, and then QAnon happens, I think you have to be careful.
Yeah.
Like, like, I know that like Amy Therese is always twinning on left Twitter like crazy because all you people who hate React to her give her more power, you dummies. But like I will say this about leftists, and I used to be bad at this myself. Constantly talking about what you hate gives what you hate airtime. Like
that's the liberals fucked up with Trump. That's exactly how it happened.
it was good for their ratings for a while.
Oh, it's great.
And I was actually just reading about how like I hear all these liberals on liberal podcasts say like, "Oh, Trump is gone and we can go back to watching the news again." And I'm like, "Oh, that's funny because the news ratings have dropped like a rock."
Yeah, I, for example, like I used to follow a lot of the news, like all the left liberal news channels, and religiously for years, and I don't anymore. It's just some of them have kind of shown their true colors a bit more, and aren't as good as I thought they were. Sometimes I've just had realizations that these people aren't worth following. Um, but yeah, the the interest in the news now is Like, admittedly, it's like, who cares what fucking Biden and Pete Buttigieg are up to? Like, they're all our enemies no matter what they do.
I mean, I think the problem is that you've had a lot of people who believe that the Squad in the United States really was an oppositional force to the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and now they have to deal with the fact that that's just transparently not true.
Yeah.
I mean, I could have told you that AOC was a Ted Kennedy staffer as much as she was Jenny from the block, but whatever. And
Yeah,
I'm going to piss a lot of people off with that comment.
I think even I fell for it a bit too in 2018, 2019. But it started to unravel in 2020.
And that's why it's important though that we don't let. I'm all about left. Well, actually, I'm not about left unity. Actually, I'm about I'm about programmatic unity, not left unity. I'm all about programmatic unity, but I'm going to be honest with you. Like, it's been a problem seeding the critique of people, taking a lot of this turn left, the movement of the Overton window to funnel people back into the Democratic Party, and letting these post leftists and stuff be the people stating these critiques. It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
they're the ones who've been saying it the loudest and the longest. At least it seems, anyway.
Yeah, I'm gonna put some good, interesting comments on here, and then we're gonna go on to the next section. But so otherwise, we'll be here all night. In regards to the neo post left, neo Sockdam is already the left wing. There is no alternative. Being further right than that to critique the center is steeped in status quo despite their populism. Well, populism is always like that. Like, I remember all these post leftists love Christopher Lasch, but they haven't read his first 3 books where he talks about how populism is a dead end for that reason. That eventually all populism can do is mirror the status quo or devolve into conspiracy theories, and that is it. But let's talk about where's a leftist to go, because this actually brings us to your bud and mine, Henrik Grossman, the one member of the Frankfurt School that most Orthodox Trotskyists like, even though it's probably true he was maybe a Stalinist. So let's.
He leaned that way.
Yes.
Actually, he actually had agreements with both Trotsky and Bukharin at different points.
Right. Well, he was an Austro-Marxist, to be completely fair to him. What is weird is he decided that Stalin was back to a progressive Bonapartism around 1935, which is a weird time to do it. To me, that's maybe defensible in the 20s, but not the 30s. This is kind of what causes the break with the Frankfurt School. I think Horkheimer unfairly accuses him of positivism, and then unceremoniously breaks with him after he'd been one of the 2 really staunchly Orthodox Marxists within the Frankfurt School, and there weren't many ever, actually. After the founder of the Frankfurt School died, Grunberg, who was again an Austro-Marxist. But part of what was driving Horkheimer to call him a positivist was fears that he was actually too sympathetic to Stalinism. Although Horkheimer didn't say that, because they were both in the United States and he didn't want to condemn him to being shipped back to Germany. It's interesting though, because at the end of his life, I don't know if Rick Kuhn does write about this, and I've definitely read about it from other Grossman scholars. He moves to Eastern Germany, regrets it, and dies within 2 years. His life ends up being pretty tragic. He wasn't purged or anything. He died a natural death, but he very much thought maybe he didn't understand things as well as he thought. But this is not really what I take issue with him. We all make mistakes, and he never unequivocally endorsed Stalin ever. Yeah. So to call him a Stalinist is sort of, unfair. But I know why they were worried about it. The issue with him for me is that he comes up with one of the best theories of Marxist crisis theory, but it does 2 things that I think are one is it fixes the immiseration thesis, because the linear immiseration thesis, which I don't think was what Marx believed in the 1850s, he doesn't seem to have believed it by the 1870s. And I could go into why based off letters to Engels and other Marxists. If I could tell you the book, if you want to read on this, there's two of them. They're both by Marcel Musto, who's one of the Mega 2 scholars who is not as tied up in Michael Heinrich's weirdness, which is basically saying that Marx didn't believe in the falling weight of profits because of a Post-it note. That's only a slight exaggeration. It's literally like a musing in a letter. The immiseration thesis stuff, clearly it wasn't working out. It had caused a crisis in Marxism by the 1880s, actually. And also you have plenty of evidence that Marx had given it up, because like he had criticized the French socialists who called themselves Marxists for like trying to pass reforms that they knew wouldn't work, because he thought off of basically accelerationist grounds, and was like, no, that you don't make the working class suffer, they'll just not trust you. Like, and if that's what Marxism is, I'm not a Marxist. That's literally where that quote comes from. So Heinrich, that's not Henrik. I'm going to pronounce his name right, because everyone mispronounces it as Heinrich Grossman, and that's wrong. While I love mispronouncing European things, it seems to be like a pastime of mine, is deliberately mispronouncing everything European forever. Particularly German, which I can actually read, but whatever. It's Europeans can suck it. But I am going to pronounce his name right, because everyone pronounces it wrong. He comes up with an equation from Marx that figures out constant capital, variable capital, rate of surplus supply, rate of accumulation, and the rate of accumulation variable capital V, which is weird. Consumption share of capitalism and mass surplus of capital. And then he comes up with the organic composition of capital, and writes this out in mathematical formula. And he's one of the last people to really try to work Marx out in math. One of the reasons why this is abandoned is because his initial predictions are wrong.
Yeah.
But his initial predictions are explainable even with his are being wrong, or actually explainable with his own theory, because he comes up with 4 major countervailing tendencies within capital that are the tendencies that cut against the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Now, I think this is fascinating stuff. My only issue with Grossmanites has been that they tend to underappreciate those countervailing tendencies, messing up their predictions. So whenever they have like a precise year that everything's going to fall apart, they end up looking like Nostradamus. But you do have a crisis theory that deals with basically long form cycles, not just short form cycles. Deals with the business cycle. Tries to correct the immiseration thesis, deals with the monopoly capital thesis, which makes those two theses no longer in contradiction to each other, because everybody for a while was trying to figure out how Marx believed both that monopoly capitalization and the concentration of capital would happen, and the tendency of the rate of profits to fall was a general trend. And so he comes up with a mathematical formula for it. And the mathematical formula is pretty objective, actually. Okay. Now, the issue I have with Grossmanites, not so much with Grossman himself, is that Grossmanites often use this to say that the revolution will have to happen at a certain date.
Well, I don't think Ted says that.
No, I don't think Ted says it either. And I know that Rick Kuhn doesn't ever touch that stuff. He just tries to explicate Grossman. So... what was interesting is this led the Marxist humanists, who are pretty much the closest people to Grossman, to critique him for being an immiserationist, which I don't think he is. And they would critique him for saying that the immiseration comes from the failure of capitalists, not from the workers to rise up. So capitalism will fail. Now, I think there's a bunch of Grossmanites who realize that that this tendency towards crisis does not inherently mean socialism.
No.
So, you know, there are.
Go ahead.
No, so I know that Ted Reese has his predictions on this. Raccoon has been probably the person most responsible for resuscitating Grossman within Trotskyism, because Grossman doesn't have a historical relationship to Trotskyism that much. He had specific agreements and disagreements between Bukharin and Trotskyism because he was an Austro-Marxist, and the Austro-Marxists actually took this weird position, basically that like we work with Social Democrats when we have to in a united front, we fight fascists when we have to. We also basically take a middle way between Trotsky and Bukharin, but not Stalin's middle way. Which is, I think, why, the ones that don't get liquidated in the Holocaust and in the fight against fascism, which is where most of the Austro-Marxists died, have a sort of, it's hard to gauge where they stand on these on the Soviet Union, because they had a defensist position that was still critical of Stalinism, but also tried to split the difference between Bukharin, between the left opposition and the right opposition, in a way similar to what Stalin was trying to do. Whew, which is a lot. I like the MMT, where I have to deal with this. I like the MMT Humanities critique that basically says this stuff is a misuse of physics metaphors. I mean, that basically undoes Marxism too, but whatever.
Well, to me, speaking of MMT, to me, Grossman and the breakdown theory really helped to put the nail in the coffin of MMT, as being a force that can save or at least transition us to socialism somehow, without revolution, or without allowing capitalism to keep going, right? Because if the problem isn't demand side, and if it's actually profit side, or accumulation side, then it doesn't matter how much money you give to the people if capital is not willing to reinvest because profits are so low. Then the system has to break down regardless.
So one thing I will say to you is I have a similar opinion, believe it or not, despite I seem somewhat concessionary to MMT, because I think MMT cannot. I know there are MMTers who are trying, but MMT, as of right now, cannot get past its organic community, thus tending towards nationalism basis. You always have to. It's because it's based on some kind of organic community extending credit and debt within itself. That's a problem, because basically you have to have total autarky for it to not have all these variables that causes things to decline, right? This is where like I disagree with certain old school trots who insist that the only real money is metal commodity money. But I will say that I don't think that matters, because I think you're going to see similar tendencies in any international group. And I also think that the MMT, even if it was correct, would require a revolution to implement in the way they say it would, because anything they would do would weaken, the bourgeoisie to the point.
Yes. They wouldn't let you do it. They wouldn't let you do it. So it is naive. You just had the debate the other day, but the guy tried to explain himself out of the naivete thing, but at the end of the day, there's no reason why the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, would just let you do that. That it takes away their power inherently.
They might let you do parts of it, like keep the interest rate at zero so that their non-physical assets will inflate and they can buy more stuff with it to expand their rentier class, but they won't they won't let the workers part. Like, there's no way that could you imagine a 100% employment guarantee? Like, I agree, it would be the biggest thing for workers' power in the history of the West if you actually had it. Which is why there's no way in hell they'd give it to you.
Yeah,
I mean, it
well,
feels like
when you see the state as a neutral body, then this is the kind of crap you come up with, right? When you see the class dynamic at play.
right, and that was my point. I didn't get to make it last night because I couldn't figure out, because I wanted to be fair to the MMTers, because you think a lot of Marxists attack them with dumb arguments.
Yeah.
Um,
which is my problem of our critique of MMT. It was kind of shallow.
right. Um, what I felt like when I was doing that debate yesterday is like we were half talking to the broad general public on a very abstract level and half into super obscure shit that no one knows but us. Like, and I thought it was like, if you follow what the debates between Marxists and MMTers, I think it was useful. But if you're just walking in on that, you'll be like, what are they talking about? I personally really like Max, and I think the superstructure people are kind of fun. And I do think that Marxists have to engage with this counter theory on the left, that, you know, in a serious way. And what I found with like Bernie Sanders people is there was like we're a Marxist and we're MMTers, but we're neither, but we're both thing. Like, so for example, if you looked at like Bernie's platform, like half of it is, you know, traditional social democracy, progressivism, and half of it is like MMT policies, you know.
So what Sam was fighting for,
Yeah.
more or less.
Yeah. So it's like, where are you at, right? Like, what do you actually believe? But I do agree. Like, if you had a left that made a jobs guarantee, like it would accelerate the contradictions really damn fast, right? Like I mean, you know, and so in some ways, like encouraging them to push for that stuff is like, go ahead, be my guest, demand 100% employment guarantee. I'll help you. Like,
well, that's one of our demands, right? In our
right.
program.
It is like, it's part of the thing.
Literally one of our Trotskyite demands. But back to Grossman. To me, the only problem with Grossman's theory and Grossmanites and Grossmanism or whatever is that, like, the theory seems to be self-evidently correct. Like, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is not just something that restarts itself, every crisis, but actually over time will eventually end in the breakdown of capital. But the problem I see is that we just don't know and can't predict all of the counter tendencies. And certainly Grossman didn't have them all in the bag when he wrote about it. But as Ted wrote in his first book on Grossman's theory, Socialism or Extinction, it seems like the capitalists have run the tools in the tool bag are basically all been run out. They've been used up, and they've got very little left. There's very little wiggle room to restart the process. Unless, of course, we have a third world war. That would destroy a lot of capital. But it'll take something like that in order to make profitable. Wait, what happened? Did we die? Hmm.
Aha! We're back.
Okay, what happened?
We had total system failure.
Okay, I was talking about Grossman, right?
Yeah, you were talking about Grossman. You said we haven't figured out all the countervailing tendencies, but it gives us away. And you mentioned Ted Reese's specific book, and the capitalist overlords decided to kill our feed.
Yes. Okay, fuck. Where was I going with that?
Ted Reese's book, first book. That's what you were talking about.
Yeah. Socialism or extinction. Um, he points out. Oh yeah, he points out that pretty convincingly to me anyway that all the tools in the toolkit that capitalism has had over the past 150 years have basically been exhausted. Interest rates are at a point where they, lowering them anymore can't dig us out of recession. Profitability rates are low enough in the imperialist countries, even in the periphery countries. You're at a point where their countries are deindustrializing and just skipping that stage, going straight to service sector economies. Like, we got problems. Debt is, all kinds of debt, private debt, corporate debt, um, government debt is all at astronomically high rates now, to the point where maybe even, the MMTers are going to have a problem dealing with it. Um, so yeah, that's the main area that Ted Reese and would disagree with the MMTers, is that debt matters. I'm not sure on that one, but I am sure that the rate of profit is going to be a problem, and the countervailing tendencies are. It seems like they're really running out of options there.
Well, I mean, for one thing, I would say that this obsession with the interest rates being zero from the MMTers, when you're seeing it lead to the creation of an ever expanded rentier class, would be worrying. I mean, it would imply that maybe what they're arguing for is not capitalism. There are some people who think it's like some kind of weird new hybrid neo feudalism or something.
Yeah.
They're
Well, that's what the World Economic Forum is basically talking about, right? You don't own anything; you rent everything.
right. Is back to a rentier economy, which is one of the, not the only. I know I have medievalists in the chat who will jump on me, but one of the primary modes of medieval um, political economy is rentier. Um, and it's worrisome because I also know some dumb socialists who thinks that's what socialism would be too, and I'm like, no, bad, stop it, no. Yeah, the stream got ice picked. And yeah, and the idea of a global company town that we're going to just have benevolent capitalist overlords who are now not capitalist anymore but are rentiers because they had all the liquidity flowed towards them forever. That sounds super great.
Right. But if we're at a situation where basically, as Ted Reese says, and I think Grossman, that capital has basically abolished the source of surplus value, which is labor, um, and the profits are so low, then how, like, you have all this capital floating around onto like a pyramid, an upside down pyramid on top of this tiny amount of surplus value that's being created in actual production, physical production, commodity production.
Right. Which is
like, it's going to topple over. Or how does it not topple over?
Which is interesting because it's one of the things that I keep on pointing out that people need to pay attention to Marxists and MMTers actually share this. What MMT will say is productive capacity. They won't say labor, but they'll say productive capacity is actually the real limit of the economy within a country and within a national sphere. Now, what is the interesting thing about the service sector, right? This actually comes up in Endnotes Volume 4, which is communization theory. You take it with a grain of salt. But this insight's interesting. That what is the service sector economy? It's the only labor that you literally cannot automate away, and you can't really play offshoring games with, right? So
well, yeah, especially because, like, at the end of the day, rich people, the bourgeoisie, want a human being serving them, right? That's part of the reason they're rich and they like being capitalists, is that they don't want a robot serving them. That's not that doesn't give them power.
Right.
So
well,
they need...
also, like, a robot would eventually move like if there is a tendency of the rates of profit to fall, and there's no way to exploit the robot more than, it's like slave labor. Actually, you can't exploit it but to so far before you cause breakdown, and then you're just at cost. And there's no way to make profits from it. Like,
Right.
Which is interesting because a lot of people think that means like capitalists would never use automation, and that means that labor will never go away. But actually, the counter side of that, from a Marxist tendency that a lot of people ignore, is that technology reduces socially necessary labor time. So like it just requires you reduce labor time, thus reduce the need for labor power. And in a social society, that'd be good, right?
Yeah.
but in a capitalist society, it's bad.
Very bad.
In a social society, having more stuff to do stuff for us for free, as long as we're not exhausting the world's natural resources to do it, is a good thing.
So then, okay, so then what? Ted borrows this prediction from someone else. I can't remember, but he says that the what it looks like is that 2054 is the point of zero profits, and that the breakdown is going to happen, a decade or two before then. So, what do you see in capitalism that can push that further?
It would be interesting if capitalism can morph into a rentier economy, which would be a nightmare. It can try. I mean, but this is where like sometimes I wonder if people think things through. Like, MMT is a left-wing theory, but you can get some investment bankers to like it. Like, people should really wonder about that.
Same thing with UBI.
Well, it's not going to be worse than what we have now. It may not be worse than what we have now. The thing is, if you're a person and who is totally dependent on the state for your social reproduction, then you're also expendable. Literally. Like, if they want to get rid of you, they can just get rid of you. It's out of the kindness of the hearts that they don't.
Well, yeah, I more and more, David Attenborough has exposed himself as a Malthusian, and I feel like this is a trend that's going to evolve in the bourgeoisie as well.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think that's why the threat of eco-fascism is not insignificant, and I'm not, I consider myself on the green den of Marxism. I'm all about refocusing on green developmentalism and using less energy to do things, because there's a real energy economy, et cetera, et cetera. But like, I'm not going to do it at the expense of people when I know that if we used our resources equitably now and also weren't producing a lot of stuff just to keep the production up because you have to, we wouldn't be near overpopulation even at the current human population scale. Like, and also, I mean, like, birth rates would probably stable out at replacement, like, naturally. That's what we see the trend even in capital is. Oh God. And yes, you have seen a lot of like these, a lot of these aristocratic do-gooders take on Malthusianism, and you've also it's also like not uncommonly held on the reactionary end of the right, of the really reactionary end of the right. So yeah, but I will say that, like, right now is a pretty bleak time. I mean, like, unless you're very, very, very rich. I mean, and I find it funny because, like, whenever I hear stuff like the zero interest rate thing being propped up as an answer to this, I'm like, but we are effectively at zero interest rate now, and this is like the most unequal economy the world has ever seen, ever, even in capitalist history. Even adjusting for PPP. Like, we've had the inflation of top level wealth in ways, and I will say, a lot of people will say it is a net transfer of wealth up. Well, they haven't taxed people for it. They've just been inflating the shit out of
Right.
stocks.
So taxes might actually, well, that's the thing. I mean, taxes might actually help in some way, but it would also have a counter tendency in that it would stop the flow of capital for
right.
for a
Well,
lot of people.
it's one of the things where I try to tell people that not all European tax regimes are working class neutral. Like everybody loves VAT taxes on the mainstream liberal left,
Regressive.
and they're regressive as hell. Like they're hyper regressive. And they're also generally hidden, which is like double whammy. You're being regressively taxed, and you don't even know why. Like, it's one of those things that I think I heard someone say that like working class people don't care about inflation. Well, inflation mongering, I will admit, is a gift to rentiers and debt holders. That's totally true. But if you have hyperinflation, it is bad for the working class. Marx implied that the petty B is dying. That's why they're so reactionary.
Yeah,
like they are. I mean, like if anyone doubts that we've returned to a tendency of monopoly capital, this is why I've never totally given up on Grossmanite theory. Not totally a Grossmanite. I won't claim to be, and I'm definitely not. Like I haven't even read all of Ted's book yet. But I will say that this observation should be something we take seriously. In 1948, the United States had 48% of all the world's wealth, not because it took it, but because most of the world's wealth was destroyed in World War II. By 1971, we were in negative profitability. It took one generational cycle for that to happen. Not even a complete generation. That's 23 years.
Alan Woods takes credit for predicting that. As bad as they are at other predictions, they did claim to predict that.
Yeah, Mandel predicted too. What was interesting, because Mandel and Grossman are essentially in agreement as well on this economic stuff.
But Woods and the IMT are not Grossmanites whatsoever.
No, they're not.
In fact, I'm a lonely weirdo.
Last time anyone in this country gave a shit about inflation was when Carson was on. That's true because wages and prices have stayed roughly copacetic through debt. That's going to stop. I mean, temporal arguments only make sense if you actually look at them in the long view, and unless you think capitalism has fundamentally changed its nature entirely, which I have heard mainstream economists argue, actually, that inflation just doesn't matter anymore because it'll always keep parity, and they don't know why. And I'm like, so you don't know how your economy's operating. So no one really cares about inflation. Inflation is actually by policy mandated at 3%. The thing is, and that's not going to hurt. That actually helps. That helps small businesses. That helps workers. Actually, the reason why it's pegged that way is because 3% is not something you will notice, but it is slightly faster than most people's wages grow. So it weakens purchasing power over time. In the 70s, it really mattered. Because you weren't dealing with 3% inflation, you were dealing with like 20% inflation. However, if you'll notice in our current economy, you are being hit with inflation, not in consumer goods, but in education, healthcare, now housing, and now vehicles in ways that way outpace that 3% mark. And a lot of bourgeois economists literally don't include those things in their inflation index. So, Yeah, but so what you see right now is the reason why the petty B, like the whole like blue collar thing in America has a purchase it does is it looks working class, but in the majority, it's actually petty B, and like a few workers dependent on petty B stuff, and that world is dying. Like particularly outside of the cities, and outside of rentier economies, petty bourgeois requires, so it doesn't seem possible right now. What I mean by rentier economies, anything that involves IP, all right. And this is that weird rational core to some of the bullshit the PMC thesis people are saying. Oh, well, what's with all these state workers with IP stuff that seem to be able to make profits right now? Well, because IP is a rent, it's not a commodity, and rents don't follow the same patterns. But here's the dirty secret, right? And this is something I think Stephen would agree with, and maybe Ted Reese. Maybe I should get Ted on sometime.
You guys should have a chat.
Maybe Ted Reese would agree with me. Look at even by MMT standards, if you can't produce stuff, if you're not producing physical commodities, your economy won't grow. And if your economy can't grow, you can't inflate your way out of it. Like, one of the MMT equations actually is like there's a direct relationship of ability of your country to produce to the ability to control its inflation, which is interesting because Marxists would essentially agree with that. So, like, are they really that different from us? Yes, but it's mostly because they're class collaborationists. Why don't these economists include education, housing, healthcare? Because they're labor intensive and not. Because they're labor intensive in a way that resists the rate of the decline of the rate of profits. You know, this is the education, healthcare, and housing. Housing is the only thing that's not labor intensive, and it's also because of a lot of it functions on rent. But it's one of the reasons why I believe LVT. You look at the labor intensive industries, you can't make them cheaper. And in fact, most of them have cost disease. Is that also the case outside of America? Yes, it is. Is inflation the same rate outside of America? No, but actually, for example, housing and educational inflation in the UK is almost as bad. Housing's worse than the US, and educational inflation is almost as bad. The reason why you don't have medical inflation is the National Healthcare Service. And I actually don't know if there's medical inflation in the cost of the National Healthcare Service to the state. There may be. Sorry, I didn't like. This is now just Varn answers questions.
No worries. I'm trying to build the YouTube stream.
So yeah, I think studying Grossman is pretty important. The one thing I would be careful with, though, is if you take Grossman as automatically predicting the end of capitalism, that necessitating communism, it takes agency away from the workers. It makes capitalism the subject of capital. And I think that's a misinterpretation of Grossman, but it's one I've seen people do.
Well, then let's just make sure people read Ted, because Ted doesn't do that. Ted makes a point to say that, the generation of capital, the decay of capitalism that's inevitable, but socialism isn't. And what he advocates for, the Leninist way forward. He doesn't spend a lot of time in it, actually, in his original book on how we actually get to socialism. He explains how it might work and how we can do it with, the kind of following the Cuban model and using hemp and nuclear. He does that pretty convincingly, but it's still a bit up in the air as to how we're actually gonna overcome our neo-feudal lords. In the next few decades.
Someone's asking, did you say vehicle prices are inflated? Yes, I did. They're definitely not inflated at the rate of housing. No, they're not. They're not inflated at the rate of education. Our medical stuff too, because they're commodities, but they're commodities in the US that almost everyone needs because of lack of public infrastructure. So they follow a different market pattern. But you can actually see in the last 10 years, their prices doubled, which is way more than 3% inflation. But you're right. It's nowhere near housing. Housing's like gone crazy. Like, for example, I know people bought a house here just 2 years ago in Salt Lake, and it's already appreciated $80,000 to $100,000, and they started out at like a $200,000 house, and it's like $300,000 or $400,000 in 2 years.
Houses in my city are selling for 25% over asking price, and like the Rising just said the other day, a lot of this is coming from pension funds now. Are literally
it's pension funds, Chinese investors. Like people are buying investment properties and not even renting them or selling them or flipping them quickly. They're literally using them as a store of value. Which also should tell you something, by the way, if people are worried about stores of value so much that they're going into real estate.
Yeah, it's like it's the last place left for the idea of safe money or a return.
I would say that the military in the United States needs to be slightly less reactionary than the cops. That doesn't say much, though. One thing is that depends on when you're talking about the military, even in the last 20-year cycle. So, for example, a lot of Iraq war veterans are pretty anti-war and pretty left-wing. Right now, a lot of people in the military, because we're not in as many active hot zones, are what you would call family career military, and they tend to be invested in the military apparatus and kind of hyper reactionary. What is the role of the military in this? Well, traditionally you have people's militias. This is why I bring up that whole thing with that Christopher Lasch about how we have to think about revolution in lieu of an administrative state that has a military apparatus which nobody in the 19th or even early 20th century could have comprehended. And that's going to take some real thinking. And I think one of the shadow sides of a lot of the cul-de-sacs right now of like electoralism or revolution or whatever is no one really wants to even deal with that, like at all. What would that look like? Like, okay, if you could you imagine, I don't know, the DSA saying like, hey, every able-bodied man who can go in and get military training, go into the military to get the training and then come out. Could you imagine that? I can't imagine that. Why did IMP so easily captured by the reactionary right? Because the profit margins are low and they don't want to be proletarianized. The proletarianized PV in the urban centers actually isn't as captured. That's why there's such a big rural urban divide. Like I can explain this easily on Marxist terms. Maybe I can explain it too easily, right? Maybe you should just trust me because how easily I can explain it, but I can't explain it. At that point, there are different. Arya and I used to do a very brief show together called Antagonisms. I think Arya's tired of lefty bullshit, which I understand. I'm also tired of lefty bullshit, and I've been going at this a long time. Is a tendency for the red profit assault even relevant to capitalists reproducing themselves as a class? Eventually, if there's no production, yes. Can it be we'll all be working on Amazon's zero profit fulfillment demise? Well, yeah, but then we're not really dealing with capitalism anymore, are we? We're dealing with something else and something worse. He's called proletariat for a reason.
That's the fear, right? Is that capitalism doesn't just die; it just morphs into this neo-feudal dystopian nightmare, where we don't where workers become basically useless, and we're renting everything. We don't own anything, and there's even less social mobility than there was under capitalism.
Yeah, it's something that I'm going to try to pronounce his name right. Jairus Banerjee, JARIUSBENEJI, who was one of the people like me who was very interested in, well, if in the antique world you had, with the dissolution of slave economies, you had something close to capitalism developing, which then immediately falls apart and causes feudalism. I don't know that anything immediately is going to collapse housing prices until the investor class can't use them as a store of value. Because it's already decoupled from people being able to buy houses on demand or even rent them. So yeah, well, do I mean something like a company town? Imagine the company town run by a global elite who are super wealthy, who can use their political power to stay in power forever. I mean, and who have made you extraneous. Yeah, and imagine, yeah, basically like if BlackRock plus Bezos owns everything, and they extract rents.
Which is, I think a lot of the Hollywood movies and like this dystopian future movies got it right. Like this is it's kind of the future. Um,
Yeah, Banerjee predicts that's one thing that like that there's an analogy between late antique Rome and its merchant economy and right now. And interestingly, Banerjee was the first person to translate Grossman into English in the 70s. The Indian Trotskyist, Jairus, it might be Jairus, I don't know. Jairus, I'm pronouncing because it's close to how it's spelled. Banerjee is the person I would look in there. Yeah. Good luck. Who owns the hills? You don't have land rights. And you also probably don't have the guns to take land rights. They have drones. What are you going to
do? The answer is join the IMT.
The answer is we need programmatic unity, and I'm happy working with the IMT if we had it. Even if they create a workers' party just to enter it, but yeah, but yeah, I mean, that was one of when I was talking to Sam on a debate on your channel that got all the IMTers interested in me because I was so generous to Sam and yet still was able to be like, yeah, but like, aren't you describing essentially a feudal economy, or even a despotic economy outright? Like, you know, I have to go to this clock token. This is money, but you made me do it. And if I want my coat back and you're not going to hit me, I have to pay you these tokens and work for you. Huh. That doesn't sound so great, does it?
No. No, utopia with classes still somehow.
And and that was my other point is like the best example outside of colonial America, and certain periods of like high imperial China, which I got corrected by Colin Drum. I said that yuan instilled paper money, and they're based off of Chinese tradition, which is true. But the Chinese, even in ancient China, silver was actually the more standard currency, which I was wrong on just because a history book I was reading at the time didn't mention it. Sorry. Whenever I do history arguments, I always have to find 5 more books to prove something because everything's so compartmentalized. But my point about that is that usually the examples used from of MMT policy is like forcing not even peasants, forcing like hunter-gatherers into labor relations with imperial powers by forcing them to pay back debts and labor tokens. Like that's the historical example of the establishment of modern money. And talking about how it also involves credit and organic community, and you have the one example in colonial America where it isn't totally a shit show. But like when you get the basic like War Mosler style MMT stated for you, it sounds like basically the way that it sounds basically like the way, I don't know, Rhodesia was ran under Cecil Rhodes. Like 100 parties can think of, well, I'll describe as socialists, where they all hate each other with all this factionalism. What chance would we have? That's why I talk about programmatic unity. We can all hate each other in the same program. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, and eventually, if things do get degenerate and people do radicalize, there's going to be mostly one party that emerges from that, maybe a couple. So it's not going to be a choice between 100 different equal sects.
No, I mean, what would happen ideally is you'd have a party of labor emerging and different tendencies represented within it, and we'd still have to fight over things like sexism and racism, etc. But a lot of the things that cause that would go away, and so a lot of the attractiveness of it would go away. I mean, that's basically the classical Trotskyist critique about focusing on that first, right? Is so much of it's economically propelled anyway. Take care of the economic situation, then we can deal with the rest of it later, and it'll be a lot easier.
Class reductionism.
You know what I always say about class reductionists is they're not class reductionist enough. Like, like whenever everyone calls like Amy Teresa class reductionist, I'm like, she's not class reductionist enough. Like,
yeah.
People talking about PMC are not class reductionist. Do they deny that Capital Volume 2 exists? A socialist party greater than Labor Party? Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, historically speaking, although we don't have either, so yay. Although, I mean, or also originally the Labor parties and the socialist parties had the exact same origin, which was the coalitions of labor movements. Does this require a global collapse then, where localized economies don't necessarily create communism? If you have a global collapse without internationalism, you'll have hyper-immiseration, and it will be very, very bad. You're likely to have a bunch of thousand reactionary economies, and there'd probably be rentier economies like we're talking about.
Can't wait.
Yeah, the IMT doesn't claim to be a party, just one setting at the table. Yeah, the IMT is a tendency. It's a tendency. It's a tendency. Tendency does not mean party. This is another thing that the Trotskyists have been very good on. They see themselves as, yes, they need a party, but they know that Trotsky historically has thought that the ban on factions in the Bolshevik Party was only justifiable during the Civil War, and after that it should have been lifted. That's the historical position there. So there would be multiple tendencies within the party. Right? So,
oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yes,
Making sure
correct.
that I'm not, the Trotskyist here agrees with me and I'm not Trot speaking.
Yeah, we make a point to not it to not be a one party state or a one party well, I mean that's after the revolution, but yeah.
Yeah. Does this require global collapse? And if we have global collapse, like I said, there are a lot of people. Andy from Antifada is a collapsist, who thinks that like basically riots and mutual aid will build dual power and create communism due to the necessity of collapse. I think that is teleologically naive. But
I mean, it might happen, but
it could happen. But then we also could have like 1,000 fascisms rising up from it too. Like, who knows?
No, yeah. The idea is to organize us before that complete collapse and breakdown.
When the last capitalist is hung from the bowels of the last rentier. No, when is the revolution over? How we would tell? You would tell because basically, there would be no value relations, and that's a whole another problem. Socialism with Mad Max characteristics. Well, this is why I occasionally opt for a red Khanate. It's because sometimes I'm just like, well, barbarism's going to win. We might as well just socialize it as well. This is me being black-pilled. This is not my actual political policy. All right. We've been on for about 2.5 hours. I'd like to thank Stephen for coming on. And I know we had some audio breakdowns. We seem to have bad connectivity today. I blame Canada.
Always blame Canada.
Finish the War of 1812. All right. I'm all for a North American Union, and I won't even be a state chauvinist. But the crown must be abolished. Although, as a side note, actually, it would lead to a lot of problems dealing with the indigenous people, but we'll deal with that another day.
Yes.
Crush your enemies, hear the lamentations of their women. Yes. Nationalized telecoms. That's at best. Socialized telecoms, even better. They're not the same.
Appropriate.
Derek's Mongol boo triggers my epigenetic memory of my Persian ancestors. You know, it was a Persian who wrote the history of the Mongols. Just saying, it was Al-Rashid. Just gonna say that. But yeah, I mean, you know, we'll bring back Zuvinism on the communism. All right, I'm done. That's such an obscure joke that like 2 people in the world are gonna get it. Thank you, Stephen, for coming on. Thanks. I'd like shout out to the people today. We have Kilgore Kraut, who I've seen around. We have Spiritual Manlet, who's kind of a cyber stalker, and now I know probably a former Trotskyist. We have Ryan Milliken, who is cool. We have D. Anon, who shows up at a lot of places and hits on everybody. We have Benjamin Hanshu. We have my own friend Arya Magadamam, who I'm probably mispronouncing his name. We have Gorge Lukuch. I'm trying not to pronounce it Lukacs. We have Pittsburgh Rock and Roll Magic. Who else commented a lot today? We have Bose Core 777. We have Windows Smashing Job Creators. Okay, that's a deep cut economic joke. We had Daniel Webster. We have Electrician Apprentice. We have Joanna H. Yeah, I missed this way earlier. White women are good deliverers. It's not just because they're white, though. It's just because, like, I mean, ask yourself a question. If you're a person who's going to strive under the worst elements of capitalist conditioning and make yourself famous, what are you likely to be? We got Prague. Ooh, Crime Think. I'm just going to avoid that. We have Grimlock, who's talking about how awful the dirtbags are. And we have I ran out of, there's more than that, but I ran out of the ability to talk about it. Thank you all. Come in. We're on Wednesday night. I'm talking to PH Higgins about the Tronti Nagiri debates, which actually will bring some of this stuff back up, including class autonomy and the working class coming to a head. Autonomy is interesting, actually, because it comes out of Italian Stalinism, but basically comes to similar conclusions to Trots. So interesting that goes there. In the coming weeks, I'll have some other people on. Erica Whelan's going to talk to me more about me being wrong about medieval history. Sex is better, and guys have to work. Yeah, that's why it's better. It's because people have to work instead of, they can't just buy it. You're right.
True.
And I'll leave it on this joke. How dare you call yourself a trot and you haven't even tried to sell me a newspaper?
You guys, go to Marxist.ca right now. Sign up for our newsletter. Also, all you goddamn left comms and critical theory nerds, just do an entryism on the IMT, and you can just make it better that way. And then this will be socialism.
So we should do to the IMT what the IMT is trying to do to the DSA, what the DSA is trying to do to the Democratic Party. Yes. This is like a little Russian nesting dog of entryism. Like.
Yes.
All right.
That's the answer.
All right. Take care, Stephen.
All right. Bye, guys.